States into some, controversial exercises in South America. Peace is never to be a means. You don't, and you'll see the quote later, you don't use peace to achieve peace. Okay, peace is an end, and it's something you need to achieve. You need to achieve it. If you remember Kant, realism and idealism, you have to combine those things. Disarmament, yes, we don't think of that with regard to Theodore Roosevelt, but I was interested to see a number of times when he said, if we could just reduce arms, trying to avoid conflict in the run-up to World War I, talking about if we could just get them not to build their navies up. And then, of course, Franklin also was on that. And then diplomacy, again, you guys probably know this, or you folks probably know this. Theodore was quite enamored of his charm skills and also of his diplomatic skills, right? And so he tried to do a lot of that stuff on his own, which of course really flipped out the State Department. But all of these things, again, very, very careful about choosing to go to war. Right? And this is something that makes democracies less likely to go to war, not only to go to war, but to go to war with each other in particular. Franklin Roosevelt, diplomacy was very close to the chest. Again, from what I've been able to see so far, but a very important thing, and I just think of the relationship between Franklin and Winston Churchill. It's not Franklin Churchill, right? Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Disarmament, there's a little, an anecdote about how Franklin was very much taken by Wilsonianism. And in the 20s, he was quite the advocate of that. And it's politically convenient, but it was also, he was really smitten by that. He never really let go of that, as realist as he was. He also, just jump here since I saw it first, like Theodore, to be a democracy, you have to be civilized. Adherence to public opinion. Franklin Roosevelt, as I just suggested, he was willing to take different positions on foreign policy, depending upon where the public was. Tried to stay with it, tried to stay ahead of it. Internationalism, United Nations, other proposals of his, and cultural values that kind of go along with democratic civilization. Okay, so what I did was I kind of, so that I could talk about this, and I know I'm probably already a little too long, but Theodore and Franklin both obviously had some pretty strong views about being prepared. Franklin Roosevelt, this is 1939, obviously a time when the writing was on the wall, but Franklin Roosevelt didn't wait until 1939 to try and nudge the country toward greater preparedness, because you could see what was going on in Europe. See, this is the part I wish this guy Keith had not done this to me, I think. So I was telling you that war, you don't choose wars for light and transient reasons. Theodore was very clear about this. He said, war for levity, wantonness, brutality, or mere fancied self-interest, conquest, or power is immoral. Very consistent with Kant's, all politics must bend its knee before the moral. And again, you can see with Franklin Roosevelt the same thing. We don't just do this for conquest. We do it for good, or at least our definition of good. So here we go. This is the one thing I like that he did. Here we go. So here's a cartoon from 1916 criticizing Teddy Roosevelt's rather belligerent criticism of pacifism and of Wilson. Perhaps it's an unfair characterization. I'm not really getting into that, but I did think that this was a fairly interesting cartoon from that period, right before America's involvement. Okay, fighting with ferocity. And Theodore here talking about, the effort it takes, and Franklin. We can survive war, but we can't survive surrender. And actually the context of that quotation over there is, on your right, is that people criticizing him for restrictions on liberty and so on and so forth, and Roosevelt saying, hey, we're not going to have any liberty we don't do this. And that contradicts, you may remember that quote from Benjamin Franklin, those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. There's a different take on that. Antinomy, anomaly, conundrum, whatever it might be. Okay, if you're going to win a war, you've got to have a citizenry that's prepared to fight it. And this, again, in both instances, both Roosevelts very committed to this idea of you must have a strong citizenry. Both of these comments are very consistent with what's known as the Republican tradition. Right? Of republicanism, not meaning Republican with a capital R. Just the idea that the people, it is a people, and they need to act in unison, especially at times of crisis. So here's another Theodore bashing cartoon. Suppress them. He wants to suppress the conscientious objectors. And the figure of history here is just saying, you fool, don't you realize that's exactly what you need, is conscientious objectors, and to get into all that free speech stuff. I really like this. I assume everybody's familiar with the famous political science anecdote, right? Roosevelt wants to send a big stick around the world, and the Congress doesn't want to pay for it, so he sends it halfway around the world. Would you like your Navy back, he says. And actually, from a political science standpoint, the use of executive power, and I get to a whole other thing here on that. His use of executive power is just fascinating. But that's why I want to say this to everybody. If you have not read Wilderness Warrior about Theodore Roosevelt, you've got to read it. It's a fantastic tale of his founding of the National Park Service and what a nut job he was in the outdoors. So you've got to read it. It's called Wilderness Warrior, and it's fascinating. And he used, what I'm saying is he used a lot of executive power to do that. We'll see more about Franklin's observations here on the right, these values. And speaking of sending the fleet around, here's one of these, whatever those pictures were called, practically right in his backyard, saluting the ships as they went by Oyster Bay on their worldwide tour. And here's Franklin, I think it's 1943. I can't be certain about that because I didn't confirm it. I apologize, but I thought you'd like to see another, picture thrown in there. Oh yeah, so both of them, Theodore and Franklin, were harshly critical of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's embargo policy. Remember, Madison was Jefferson's Secretary of State, and they said, geez, we don't want to get involved in the French-British war. Of course, the French and the British wanted them very much to get involved. Gee, we don't want to get involved. Here's what we'll do, because Jefferson didn't trust the British, big surprise, ever. Here's what we'll do. We just won't sell them anything. And another advantage of that is we'll keep our ships off the seas, and in that way, we won't get attacked. And both Franklin and Theodore said, well, you've heard of the War of 1812. Well, that's what did it. You can't win peace with peace. And they just, both of them, I found it so interesting. I knew about this guy. I knew his attitude, but I was really surprised at Franklin saying a very similar thing, and I've seen it elsewhere too. So I thought I would give Mr. Jefferson a little opportunity to do some spin. And the spin that he does here is pretty much to say, hey, right, we didn't have any trade with the British, so that made us make things for ourselves. And oh, by the way, our ships didn't get attacked. And of course they didn't get attacked because they didn't leave the harbors, was the criticism that the Roosevelts had. Okay, so the next criteria, if you remember, is shared values. And these guys certainly found that they had common values. One of those was with regard, again, to national character. The nation has to be moral. And here's a guy who liked to talk, and he would, I thought that was good. Right? Roosevelt throwing the ball out. Why don't you do that again? Real quick, I know I got to stop doing that. But there we go. Okay, so that was good. Another set of shared values. This is kind of an interesting quotation from Theodore. You know, I wouldn't want to be in those authoritarian societies. I would even tolerate the American newspaper as an asset. And then at the end of the sentence, after he said, of course, it's really a liability. So speaking of the media, again, sort of consistent with that media idea. So, and by the way, the good neighbor policy, again, I'm sure you're all familiar with that idea. You know, we need to have a national character the way we have individual character. These two gentlemen really saw it the way the Greeks saw it, that individual character and national character are the same. Remember that business about sad experience, much sad experience in both instances here. Theodore and Franklin are talking about that very thing here. You know, we'll figure it out. Right? This is when he's president, right? When he's first president. And then Franklin over here, you know, if the public could just speak, there wouldn't be war. A very democratic idea. You know, so I thought this was kind of a nice picture, right? You know, bully Theodore and determined Theodore and courageous Theodore. Talk about media image. And then here's a nice fireside chat photo, right? We need to have good relations with other nations because it's dependent upon it. They all have to be democracies. This is a cartoon, very quickly, I know now I'm really in trouble. This is a cartoon of the United States leading up to World War I is trying to get the European powers to put down their arms, and none of them wants to put down their arms because they don't trust that the United States will be able to enforce. Right? It's sort of a Hobbesian kind of a problem. I thought it was an interesting sort of period cartoon, really. And then internationalism, you know, this is one of 4 photographs one could put up. I really hate the Yalta pig. It just looks so terrible in that Yalta photo. It's heartbreaking how horrible it looks. So maybe limiting armaments a little bit, and then Germany will never do this again because Germany will never be able to rearm. And armaments meant something to both of these guys. It was really, you know, it was very much a part of that period, and we still, of course, have arms limitation discussions. There are those 2 characters again. You probably know who those 2 characters are. Again, I forgot to write down who they were, and I forgot. So how committed were they to democratic principles? See, here we go. How committed were they? I think they very much were committed to democratic principles. Theodore, a little bit, perhaps excessively on the realist side, and Franklin a little bit in the other direction. But I think actually they were committed to the idea of democratic peace, and I think we can learn from that in our own time. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Henderson. And Dr. Henderson is a repeat player, and so I just take him for granted. But our next speaker is a first-timer who I'm being very, very nice to by my standards.
Yes, you are.
Teaches at Texas A&M University of Galveston, professor of history, Fulbright scholar in Poland,
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan,